If you want to be a guest on podcasts and not just be one of those people that does it for exposure, but be somebody that actually is able to convert at a very high level from podcasts, in this video, I'm going to break down for you what I call the quadrants of content. And most importantly, what to base your talking points on podcasts around so that you are ultimately able to convert at that very highest level on each and every podcast that you appear on. Now, for those of you that are new here on this channel, all we talk about are two things. Number one, getting booked on podcasts where your ideal clients are spending their time. And number two, all of the best practices to help you convert those people at the very highest level from podcasts. And today I got an absolute banger for you. And the reason is because quite frankly, when most people go on podcasts, they totally butcher it. More importantly, when I say butcher it, what I mean is that I have conversations with people all of the time and they tell me, Devin, I go on podcast and number one, I don't even know if I get results. Now I'm going to save this. We have other videos where we talk about attribution and how to actually track metrics from podcasts and leads and sales. That's another problem. But more importantly, number two, people say, I don't really think they worked for me. And what ends up happening is people lose the belief that podcasts could be the vehicle that could work for them and help them get business. But it doesn't actually come down to the vehicle themselves. It comes down to the content that they shared on the podcast. And more importantly, and specifically, the talking points that they had on that podcast. Now, when I say that, sometimes people say, Devin, listen, the podcast host asked me questions. How am I supposed to control what that person asks me? Now, in another video, we did talk about what we call podcast introduction mastery, which ultimately boils down to how do you influence a podcast host to follow your lead? And I'm going to touch briefly on that because here's the reality of the situation. The podcast host is the conduit and the facilitator between you and your ideal client who is tuning into that podcast. So with that being said, you need to be able to articulate your message in a way where you're not only reaching the audience, but you're getting the podcast host to follow your lead. So the next question he or she asks is the question that you want that person to be asking you because it's going to allow you to get into that next talking point or to get to where you ultimately want to get. Now, comma, period, however you want to put it, hyphen, M dash, whatever. Understand this, and I talk about this in depth on this channel, is that these podcasts are your ultimate method and way of influencing the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs of your ideal client. And that is your number one goal on these podcasts, is to do those three things and to influence those three things. However, it is impossible to do that if you just show up like most people on podcasts and just tell your story and just answer the questions that the podcast host is asking. And it's just like a dialogue between you and the host. But you have to understand, right before I dive into the 4 quadrants of content, I want you to look at you being a guest on podcasts like there's three people sitting at a round table. There's you, the host, and the audience. What most people do is they just talk to the host, they answer the host question, the host asks them another one. They answer the host question, the host asks them another one. And they completely ignore that there is somebody on the receiving end of that message, AKA a listener. So what you need to master the art and skill of is how do you transform the listeners both individually and collectively. And that's what I want to talk with you about, diving into what we call the 4 quadrants of content. Now, I get this thing all the time is, Devin, what do I actually talk about on these podcasts? What's the best practices for articulating my talking points, sharing my message, my story, all of these different things? And I'm going to boil it down to these 4 things. But what I ultimately want you to understand before I get right into that is I have people all the time, they ask me, Devin, what do I talk about on these podcasts? Now, how we view podcasts on this channel is not for exposure and marketing and awareness, like all of these people online tell you about. No, you being a guest on podcasts is one of the number one things that you can do to sell more of your stuff. Why? Because they build the ultimate level of trust, and trust in today's modern age is the number one thing that you need in order to sell your stuff at a high level, because people have been scammed, robbed. They've just had all of these gurus promise them the world, but they weren't able to deliver. So whoever could build the most trust is going to be the person that could sell the most stuff. So with that being said, if you look at podcasts as a vehicle and something that you use within your sales process to ultimately help you sell more stuff, well, wouldn't the content that you share on podcast, the talking points that you articulate on podcast, don't you think it would be a really great idea to get that content from your sales process? In other words, when it comes to messaging and what are the messages and things that you are going to communicate on these podcasts that you are appearing as a guest on, this is what I would advise you do. Go have your sales team pull up the last 100 sales calls, load them up into my preferred LLM at this time is Claude, and go to Claude and see what were all of the most common reasons why people aren't buying. What are the most common objections that people are having? What are the most common common questions that people are having? What are the expectations that people are showing up on these calls? What are the things that people believe to be true that aren't true? Because here's the thing, your audience, your prospects, let them give you the content. You do not come up with the content. Sure, you're going to come up with the stories, you're going to come up with how you articulate those points, but let your audience give you the talking points. And the way that you do that is simply by the data. What is the data telling you? What is the sales team communicating with you? What are the setters talking to you about? What are your sales reps saying that people are saying on the phone? And then, like I said, please leverage AI to extract these things. And if you're not already recording your sales calls, definitely go get Fathom.ai and do that. But get the sales calls, transcribe them, grab those transcripts, go to Claude, have it give you all of that information. Have it tell you what are the most frequently asked questions, what are the most common things that people believe to be true that are not true, what are the objections that I'm getting most frequently, and number 4, what are the expectations that people have coming onto these calls. Now, bonus points number 5, and a great way to measure the effectiveness of the podcast that you're appearing on is how well framed do people show up? In other words, are they ready to make a buying decision, or do they just show up to be educated and they don't really know what it is that you do? What level of education and sophistication and due diligence have they done previous to your sales calls or whatever sales event you use? So now when you deploy the podcast and a lot of the ways that we talk about on this channel within your sales process, you're able to clearly see the before and after of how well framed people are showing up to your sales event. So now that leads me perfectly into the quadrants of content. Now, with that being said, the quadrants of content boils down to 4 key pillars. Pillar number 1 is this: when you're on a podcast, part of your job is to articulate quadrant 1. What are the questions that your ideal clients currently have that, if left unanswered, will stop them from buying, or at least lower the chances of that person buying? Now, with that being said, this is where your sales calls and your data comes into play. When you're able to say, here's the 5 most frequently asked questions that I get on my sales calls. Well, what if you're able to go on a podcast and by how you articulate your message, your stories, etc., you're able to answer all of those questions for your prospects prior to them entering that sales conversation. So now what's going to happen is your closers, your sales team, or you, if you're still selling, is you are going to notice that people show up more educated. And when people show up more educated, they're more likely to buy, because the more educated they are, the more that they typically trust you. So step 1 is identify what are those most frequently asked questions that I get, that if I could place the answers to those questions in front of my ideal client before them entering my sales process, would dramatically increase the chances that they buy. So when you're on a podcast, you want to be articulating the answers to those questions. Now, what I'm not going to go to in this video, simply because we don't have the time, is exactly how do you do that. But understand that the talking points that you have, and what we work a lot with our clients on a one-on-one basis, very high level coaching, is crafting the talking points around answering those questions without coming off and being like,
the question my clients ask me all of the time is...
No, that's not what I'm talking about here, okay? There is an art and a science to this. But that's quadrant 1, is making sure that some of the content that you're talking about on podcast is addressing the questions that your prospects are asking on your sales call or whatever sales event that it is that you have, so that now when you place those answers in front of them via your podcast, and that's why we highly recommend, if you're watching this and you have a sales team, leverage these as what we call a sales asset and a trust asset, where your sales team is sending these podcasts to your prospects before the call. So now that they show up to the call already having the answers that they probably wouldn't have had otherwise, which is going to increase, number 1, the frame in which they show up. You'll notice that they show up much more educated, but more importantly, number 2, it'll influence them to buy at a higher rate. So that's 1. What are the questions that your ideal clients have that, if left unanswered, would lower the possibility and probability that that person buys? Quadrant number 2 is simple. What are the myths and false beliefs that your ideal client currently holds about achieving the dream outcome that you help them achieve that is currently keeping them stuck? In other words, a great example of this is, let's say that you help people lose weight. Well, a big myth or false belief might be, I have to eat 1,200 calories a day in order to lose weight. So now when I'm on a podcast, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to talk about one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And one of the things that people believe that keeps them stuck is that in order to lose weight, you have to eat 1,200 calories a day. In fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. So now what you're doing is you're shifting that person's belief through the podcast. So hopefully you see where we're going here is number one, we're answering the questions, and the questions could be about us, our sales process, about anything in regards to whatever the most frequently asked questions that your prospects are asking. I can't give that to you. And now we're shifting those beliefs. Now what they used to believe, they had to eat 1,200 calories a day, or in order to invest, you have to have a ton of money up front, or to grow your business, you need to invest in ads. Whatever the big myths and false beliefs that currently people are holding that are keeping them where they are, if you're able to meet them in that, and you're able to articulate that to them, but more importantly, articulate it in a way where you clearly demonstrate that you get them, then what happens is you become the bridge between that false belief and that new belief. That you don't need to eat 1,200 calories a day. You could actually eat 2,000 calories a day. The only difference is the strategy behind it. And guess who holds the strategy? You. So that's the second thing, or what are the false beliefs? What are the myths that are currently keeping your ideal client stuck where they are? That if they actually believe the belief they need to hold, I know there's a lot of beliefs in here, okay? That would actually help them get better results, and you become the bridge. Quadrant 3 is simple, objections. And this is where you need to be looking at what are the most frequent objections that you and your sales team are getting. So if it's price, if it's timing, if it's something that's personal to them, like they don't believe it's possible for them, when you're on podcasts, a lot of your talking points need to be based around those objections. Because here's the thing, I learned this once about 5 years ago. I went to an event that was hosted by a guy named Jason Fladlian, and he's known as the king of webinars. He was like a mastermind behind all of these big people's webinars, helped them rake in tons of money. Anyways, at this event that I paid $5,000 for a 2-day event when I was like 20 years old, I had no money, so I had to put it on a credit card that I got that had like 34% interest on it. Don't ask me, it's not financial advice, okay? I don't need your financial advice. Anyways, I showed up to the event, and what he said was, the number one way to overcome an objection is to give it to them before they ever knew they had it. So now when you go on a podcast, if you're able to articulate those objections before they ever know that they are going to have those objections, you shift their belief subconsciously so they won't ever have that objection. So let me give you an example. Let's say that commonly the people that you work with, they just think that it's too expensive. Well, now you have two options. You could either have your sales team address it once the prospect has dropped it on the call, which we all know is not the funnest experience all of the time. Or number two, you can be proactive and give that objection and overcome that objection without that person even realizing it. So with that being said, if I'm on a podcast, I might tell a story, and the story might go something like this, where I remember back in 2021 when I first went on an app called Clubhouse. And Clubhouse was an audio-based app where you got in a room just like I'm in right now, and everybody in the room was talking about the same thing. So if you wanted to go in a room and talk about investing, you go in that room. You want to go in a room and talk about business, you go in that room. Well, the first time I went on Clubhouse, I went in a room and it was talking about storytelling. And the person that was hosting the room was none other than my childhood hero, Les Brown. And I went in there, I had like a major fangirl moment. I was like, oh my God, it's Les Brown. I can't believe it's Les Brown. And it was like I saw the Messiah. You know, it's like seeing Superman. And anyways, I was listening to the conversation and I was just observing. I was so excited. I couldn't believe I was there. And then Les Brown started to talk about the fact that he was launching a new program called Hungry to Speak. And in Hungry to Speak, he was going to teach you how to articulate your message, tell your story, get on stages, get paid to speak. And my goal was to be a motivational speaker, partially because I was so bullied as a kid that motivational speaking is the thing that changed my life. Listening to other people's messages, I wanted to be that for other people. So as he was telling the story, as he was telling us about Hungry to Speak, I was just getting so excited and so excited. Like, oh my God, I need this. But the one underlying question that I had was, how much is it? So pause right there. Your ideal clients, as they're on a sales call with you, what is the question that they're probably having in the back of their head? How much is it? Right? So what we're doing is we call these embedded commands, where we're embedding the things that your ideal clients typically tell you on sales call throughout your story. So now as I continue, let's go back in. I couldn't stop thinking about how much is it? How much is it? Finally, he got to the price. He said, it's only $297 a month. And when he said that, it looked like I ate carrots for 27 days in a row.
Huh, $97 a month.
I had no idea how I was going to afford that. Notice, what's the objection that we had? It's too expensive, right? That's the objection your ideal clients have. So now when I'm telling this story, that ideal client that's listening, they're living vicariously. Where now, instead of them thinking, oh, it's too, they're taking themselves in their mind right now to a time in their life where they had a similar experience. They're mirroring my experience with their experience. So now I'm taking them on this journey with me, okay? So with that being said, I can't afford that. That's too much money. So what did I do? I ended up calling my dad and I said, Dad, you know Les Brown? He said, of course I know Les Brown. You love Les Brown. You listen to him all the time. I said, Dad, I really want to join his program. And my dad said, great, do it. And I said, Dad, there's one problem. And he said, what is it? Okay, period, pause, time out. Notice the vocal variety with which I have. Notice my pauses, my up, down, tonality, pacing, time it. I said, Dad, it's $297 a month. Oh. And he said, okay, do it. I said, Dad, I can't. I don't got the money. I had just bought a house. I had just bought a car. I was 22 years old, just went into the military. I think I was 21, 22. Now here's the thing, pause, time out. Your ideal client probably has a lot of stuff going on in their life that would be a great reason for why they can't afford what it is that you have. So as I am telling that story, subconsciously, they are going into their story. Okay, let's go back. So with that being said, so my dad said, okay, Devin, you want me to lend you the money? And I said, no, Dad, you've done enough for me. And he said these words to me that changed my life forever. He said, son, figure it out. Pause. Figure it out. So what am I doing? I am embedding a command in the audience that when they are faced with a situation to make a financial decision that they know will take them to the places that they want to go, that they need to figure it out. And listen to the pacing there in the tonality. Figure it out. That is a very authoritative type of tonality that speaks to the subconscious. So now what am I doing? I'm getting that person in the state of mind that they need to be in, because I know that my ideal client typically comes up with that objection. So I'm shifting that previous to that person ever entering my sales process. Or now if I take this podcast and I send it to somebody that came from a cold advertisement, they came from a cold email, they came from a meta ad, and I place this in front of them with this type of messaging. Hopefully you see how this shifts everything. So going back into the story, my dad said, figure it out. So I said, all right, Dad, I will. And I hung up the phone and I just sat there and I took out this credit card that I got when I was 18 years old, 34% interest on it. And I just asked myself the question, are your goals and your dreams worth it? And I just sat there for a minute and I said, yeah, they are. And I made that decision. 2 weeks later, I got on an onboarding call. They sent me an email. They said, sign up for your one-on-one onboarding call here. And I got on the call and it was me and Les Brown. And he said, Devin, he didn't even say hi. He didn't say, hey son, how you doing? Nice to meet. He said, Devin, why are you here? And I said, sir, I want to be the greatest speaker in the world. That was my goal at the time. And he said, oh, it looks like we got a lot of work to do. So that ended up being the greatest decision of my life, because I ended up starting Storypreneur, a company where we specifically worked with entrepreneurs to help them craft their message and share their story in a way that was able to influence and persuade their audiences. So hopefully you see through that story how I overcame an objection prior to that person ever knowing that they would have. Now, am I saying that every single person that shows up to your sales call, you're going to totally eradicate and eliminate the it's too expensive objection, or I can't? No. But what I am saying is, how can we overcome that objection as many times as possible prior to that person ever entering the sales process? So now if 20% less people give you that objection and you get 20% more people to start buying your stuff, that'll probably help the business if I am not mistaken. All right, so let's move on to the last quadrant, which is going to be number 4, expectations. In other words, when I say expectations, or what are the expectations that people need to have about what it looks like to be successful with whatever it is that you help them achieve. Also, number 2, what are the proper expectations that they need to have if they wanted to work with you specifically? So let me take my offer as an example. We get people booked on podcasts, show them how to monetize, everything that we've been talking about here today. One of the expectations that I need people to have is that this is going to be a long-term game. You cannot come in the first 30 to 60 days, 90 days, expect that you're going to get a bunch of clients, because you need to schedule the podcast, you need to go on the podcast, then they got to edit it, then they got to throw it in the queue, then they got to release it. All of these, it takes time. So if I know that I need my prospects to have that expectation prior to them entering the sales conversation, well, what am I going to do on a podcast? I'm going to say something like this. And one of the things that I need people to understand is that this is a long-term game. When it comes to podcast guesting, you being a guest on shows, whether you work with us, another company, or do it by yourself, don't expect a financial ROI in the first 90 days because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now if I set that expectation, they come into the sales conversation in that frame of mind, already having that expectation to be true, rather than them showing up with their expectations. And that's when you run into problems. When somebody shows up with one expectation of what it should look like versus what your expectations actually are, if you can't bridge that gap, that's how you lose a lot of sales. So now when you go on these podcasts and you talk about what proper expectations must actually look like, number one, you're going to immediately push away everybody that just wants a quick fix, that wants to get rich overnight, all of the people that you don't even want as clients. And simultaneously, you're going to attract to you the people that you do want as clients. Okay, other expectations might be like, how long does it take? What are the average returns that somebody sees with this? How much effort am I going to have to put into it? All of these things. And once again, that's why I started this conversation with your sales process. This is where you get those expectations from. Okay. Also, look at the expectations that you set during your onboarding calls. Bring them into the podcast. And obviously, as you could tell, we're not weird about this stuff. We're not like,
you need to expect this.
One of the things that we currently see is that sometimes people come into the conversation and they think podcast is going to get them results overnight. The reality is it's not because of XYZ reason. Okay. And that's why it's very important. One of the things that we do with our clients so much further than just getting them on the podcast is making sure we're incorporating these quadrants of content in a way that seems natural, that's authentic, that's genuine, that people genuinely like to show to simultaneously while you are delivering an immense amount of value. So hopefully you see how, number one, answering the questions that your ideal clients have that if left unanswered would prevent them from buying. If you answer those, you're moving people further along that buying journey. Number two, if you dismiss their myths and overcome their myths and their false beliefs, they move further. Number three, if you overcome their objections, they move further. And number four, if you set proper expectations, they move further. So hopefully you see how the talking points on these podcasts should not come from what you want to hear. They should come from what your ideal clients and prospects need to hear in order for them to move further along that buying journey. And yes, because here's the thing, what you do, if you're watching this, is incredibly valuable. And you need to do everything in your ability to make sure that you get people to take the desired action that you need them to take, because you know that that is a decision that they will never regret. And I want you to think about this for a second, because I had somebody tell me this one time when I was like, well, I don't know if I want to do that. And he was like, listen, what I need you to understand is this. If you don't, somebody else who cares half as much about your clients as you do, who just wants it for the money, who won't take care of them, will. So you need to do everything in your ability to make sure that you get people over that line. Because if you don't, somebody else that cares half as much as you do and is doing it for the wrong reasons will. And that person is going to get hurt. And for you, if you're watching this, I know that you're one of those people that actually delivers. So go out and do this, because your people deserve it. Knock down those 4 quadrants of content. And on these podcasts, you'll see, if you incorporate these podcasts in your organic and paid marketing, as well as your sales process, I guarantee that you're going to see such a tremendous difference in how framed people show up, how educated people show up, and ultimately how people buy.